The verdict is in. Less people attend church than ever. But why is this the case? What's wrong with our nation, and does the church share the blame? I'm Jonathan McNair with TWNow, and today's guest that I'd like to introduce, first of all, Mr. Josh Lyons. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Lyons. Mr. Lyons is a regular guest on our program, becoming a regular guest, so thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we're also Skyping in Mr. Rod McNair. So again, a welcome to Mr. Rod McNair. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to talk about the vanishing church today. And in terms of this topic, you find some people argue that the church is going away. It's not part of society. Others will say, well, no, its demise is not accurate. So let's talk just for a couple of minutes as we begin about this issue. According to different polls and surveys that argue this point, what is the situation today? Could you gentlemen talk about it a little bit? Mr. Lyons, you want to begin?
Some of the research that we've looked at and talked about shows that the overall trend of attendance in Christian churches in the U.S. is going down slightly year by year. Some groups might be increasing a little more, but the overall trend is that it's going down. And I think that reflects itself in the way society is making decisions and acting and the fruits of society.
Ms. McNair, how about you? You have something to add to it here?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of different studies that have been talking about this for some time, and some studies that even go back several decades. And there's an attempt to try to figure out what is the state of the church, but generally, there is less church attendance, and there is less church, let's say, identification with organized religion in general, and that seems to be the general trend.
One of the voices here in the past decade that has stirred up a lot of hype about the church's decline is Barna's work, especially with younger people, with millennials. So you are a token millennial for Josh with us here today. Why do you think that is? Why is it, according to his research, and I say the group's research, there is a particularly dramatic decline in terms of attendance in church on any given week among millennials?
Right. I don't know if I love that label, but I guess it is true.
You got to own it.
The stereotype is not the best. But I think part of the problem, or there are multiple factors. One is the product of what millennials are growing up in, the families that they've been growing up in. We've talked about on this program and other things that our church produces about how the traditional family is breaking down. I think that's part of it. I think just like any person would do, and especially younger people, they recognize hypocrisy and they're turned off by that. So if younger people don't see authenticity in a minister or a preacher or a church, then they're really going to be turned off by that. Some other factors that we might talk about, some are the role that technology plays. YouTube videos are very easy to look at and find sermons. And people are on their phone all the time. You see that going around everywhere. So I think those are some of the factors why young people might be going to church less than older people right now.
Is the church relevant for our younger generations today? Is it relevant?
I think it's very relevant. I personally go to church every week, and I don't think that's the norm for someone in my age group in the U.S., but it is very relevant, and I think it's hard for people in my age group today, in today's society, to see that, because there is so much other things coming at them. Not only are evangelicals or Christian preachers trying to get their attention, but you also have famous atheists throwing their ideas that you can easily find on YouTube, and those people can be very charismatic and somewhat persuasive. So there are a lot of, we're bombarded from different angles by all kinds of theories and philosophies, so it can be hard for a young person to really know God and know the truth.
So let me ask you, Mr. Robin, there, is our society and our culture to blame for this general, I'm going to say for our program, a general decrease in the church as being a relevant, important part of people's lives? I think if we can use that as a definition, because, and this program is not necessarily, we're just introducing the topic here, but the program is not necessarily about the ins and outs of that trend. But we can say that typically speaking, there is a downward trend in terms of the relevance and engagement and importance of going to church in daily life of most Americans. So, is that the fault of the church? Is that something that the church should share the blame in?
Well, to jump into that. Actually, if I can take just a step before that to talk about how there are some people who today are saying the church is not in decline, the church is healthy. It's been static in terms of, and even some say that there's a little bit of an increase over the last few decades in church attendance. But that issue, I think, is even instructive because others question those statistics, and there are really two ways that data is being taken. There's a figure that is generally reported of about 40% of Americans are churchgoers, but here is the problem: that is self-reported. Those are taken by telephone interviews where people are asked, how many times have you been into church over the last 2 or 3 weeks, or were you at church in the last 7 days? 40% are self-reporting, yes, I was. But on the other hand, if you count it differently, if you actually take a head count, there are other groups that are studying this, and they're saying it's more like 20% of the population generally is in church each week. And they call it the halo effect, that if a researcher is calling on the phone and they're asking you a question and you know what the right answer is that they are really looking for, you're going to tend to overemphasize what you're doing as opposed to perhaps speaking the truth. So I think that maybe is a helpful thing just to interject here as we're setting the stage.
Okay. So on the whole, how would you characterize, let's say, church and going to church, the issue of going to church for most people? Let's look at it from a younger perspective and let's say a little bit older perspective. What would you characterize, let's say, what church means to, let's say, 50-something and 30-something? What does church mean to people who do go to church? Josh, would you?
So personally, what I would say, just thinking,
it's the average person, not necessarily yourself.
I'm very average.
Speak for the average millennial.
Right. Going to church every week, what does it mean, or for the average person? I think people are looking for. They are looking for something. They want to feel good spiritually. I think we all have a fundamental desire to be happy and to avoid pain and things like that. And one way that people can look for that is look to going to church. But I think as we're discussing, part of the problem is they go to church, but they don't find answers to all of their questions. Mm-hmm. So that's what we would say an average churchgoer may feel in the country. And we'll get into some of the answers to that.
And then on the other side, let's say the other 80%, why don't the other 80% of our 30-somethings go to church?
One thing we've talked about here on the program in different places is the rise of nuns. They're called nuns in some of the research because they check the nun box on a religious survey. So they're not Catholic or not Jewish or different religions. So they're unaffiliated religiously. Mm-hmm. And there's a somewhat of a movement there where people are saying I can be spiritual if I want to without committing to a specific religion or a specific body of people or organization. Some people don't want to be spiritual at all, but I think young people can claim that I can be spiritual without going to church.
Okay. So, and we want to focus on that, what that means, going to church, here just in a second. How about the 50-somethings? How would you say, those who do go to church, those who don't go to church, what and why?
I think what Josh just said a moment ago is spirituality without religion is what a lot of people are looking for. And the same is true for those that are, let's say, in their 50s and above. I think that they are all too often, if people are looking for hope, they're looking for something, a sense of the future, but all too often they also have been, because of conditioning, because of the way our churches tend to cater to the lowest common denominator, a lot of times what people decide on why they go to this church or that church is that, the good coffee, the friendly welcomers, the daycare, maybe they're taking care of their children or their grandchildren, and maybe a church has a great youth program, and that becomes one of the defining factors of the church. And so a lot of people are well-meaning, but really have determined what church to go to based on wrong priorities.
Okay, so we began a little bit with how the church is becoming generally, as a society, less relevant. When we don't believe in a God, when we believe that it's okay to kill our babies, when we believe that it's okay to engage in perverted sexual practices, as a society, you have to say we are, as a whole, becoming less godly, and church and what church is supposed to be all about is becoming less of it for a majority of people. Again, we're talking with broad brushes here, but I want to get into the what it should be. Now, what should church be? Why should people attend church? Why does it matter? We talk about the vanishing church, but for our audience, why should our audience go to church? What are the reasons? What's the point of going to church anyway? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit here in the last half of the program. So let me ask you. I guess you're up next on the hot spot here, Josh. Why is it necessary to go to church? Why is it necessary anyway?
If you believe the Bible, it's very necessary. The Bible clearly shows, number one, that God commands us to go to church. There are multiple places you can go to see that. Jesus Christ himself and some of the apostles clearly went to church on the Sabbath and taught different people, read from the scriptures. So that's reason number one. God commands us really to go to church. As far as personal reasons, even if you didn't believe that main point, there are benefits of going to church, such as one thing personally that I feel and believe is that when you go to church and you're a part of that group of people that you believe are following Christ, and that you come under you could say the authority or maybe you could say the care of the ministry. And if you believe that it is God's church and He's directing His ministry, the ministers are really there for your own good. They are there to help you, to counsel you, to guide you through some of the big decisions in life. I know in our church I've counseled with ministers over baptism and then marriage, and I take those things seriously because I believe they represent God Himself. So I think that's an important piece that has literal benefits in your day-to-day life.
What are some other reasons why church is necessary? What do you say, Rod?
Well, following up on what Josh said, as he mentioned that the ministers are there for your good, for us as we attend. And really, one of the most vital ways that the ministry serves those that are attending a church is preaching the truth. is telling them the truth, is teaching doctrine straight out of the Bible. And that is, I think, where that's the big unknown and untalked about issue in this day and age, that our tradition, our Protestant tradition, Catholic tradition, whatever church you talk about that is mainstream, has not just been in decline for a few years or even a few decades. It's based on wrong teachings, and those seeds were sown not in the 80s, not in the 50s, not in the 30s, but centuries ago, when the leaders that the movements that have become the churches today based their teachings on unscriptural principles. And so what is the church's function and primary need and role? To absolutely teach the truth, and you find the truth straight out of the Bible.
So part of going to church is learning, and learning the right things, learning what the Bible teaches. What advice would you give to somebody who's going to church and they're religious about it? I mean, in terms of they're regular and they're dedicated to going to church. Let's say every Sunday. They're going every Sunday morning. In fact, sometimes they go more than once in a week, but they recognize that what they're being taught from the pulpit is not true, but yet they want to be dedicating going to church. What would you tell them?
Along with what Mr. McNair said, I think from articles that we've discussed and things we've read, is that especially for maybe the younger group, millennials, is that they're pitched this idea that there is no absolute truth. Mm-hmm. Everyone, you can kind of tolerate everyone, every type of person. You can tolerate any type of belief if it's not, hurting anyone directly. And if you don't believe in an absolute truth, then you're really going to be lost, because the Bible is very clear that there is absolute truth. Jesus Christ is the truth, and he says the truth. That's what we believe in the Bible, that his word is truth. And if that's a fundamental piece, that if young people or any person, if they don't understand that there is absolute truth, there's an objective truth that comes from God, they're going to be lost. And then if you don't believe that, you don't know what church to go to, because you.
So in terms of church, it's not okay to go to just any church, because in a sense, if learning the truth is part of why it's important to go to church, well, then if the church you're going to isn't teaching the truth, in a sense, you should stop going. Would you agree? I mean, for those who are very dedicated, that may be a hard pill to swallow, but that is critical, as you've said, to the church. We assemble ourselves together with believers in the truth. Go ahead.
I think of my wife has a good friend from her childhood and teenage years, and you'd say she's in a Protestant evangelical type church, and she was interested in some of our beliefs, and her and my wife had different discussions, and she's very sincere and very devout. And she started to seem to understand some of the beliefs that we understand from the Bible. And what it comes down to, a lot of those types of people, I think it's very important to them where they would say, I love Jesus with all of my heart. And that's very important to them. They listen maybe to a lot of Christian music about Jesus. But I think the fundamental question there is, if you really love him, it's very clear. He said what you do if you love him. He says, if you love me, then you will keep my commandments. And he also said that you will remain in my love if you keep my commandments, just as I kept my Father's commandments. And I think that's a very key piece where people will talk about love, which, of course, that's very important when you look at the Bible. But as we're talking about truth and God's law really teach you what real love is. So if you say you love Jesus Christ, do you do what he says?
Do you, Rod, do you think that is why for many people church is meaningless? Because they recognize that a church that teaches, for example, that Santa Claus comes down a chimney and the Easter bunny lays an egg, and somehow, in some way, it's associated with the death of Jesus Christ, that an average person looks at that and says, this is crazy, this doesn't make any sense, and therefore that going to churches doesn't appeal to them. Do you think that's why we have such a dearth in our country of people going to church?
Absolutely. And because oftentimes you hear young people, let's say there were young people, younger generations, but what oftentimes criticize the church for? Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. They look at how the leaders, the elders are doing things and are teaching things, are speaking things, and then they look in the Bible and they don't add up. And so, of course, they would be discouraged and they would be frustrated if they're really seeking for truth when they look and they see hypocrisy. So one of the things that we have to look at is, we need to understand that Christ built a real church that is based on real doctrines, real commandments, and it's going to accomplish His will without hypocrisy. And we have to judge the church and the congregation, the fellowship we're talking about, based on, is it really following what Christ taught, or is it being hypocritical? And if it's being hypocritical, then walk away.
So as we read, Paul wrote to Timothy, I believe that the church is the pillar and ground of the truth. So going to church is not enough. Let's acknowledge that, right? Going to church is not what it's all about. It's about going to learn the truth. And if the church is not teaching the truth, then it really serves no purpose except an exercise in our dedication to a cause. Let's go to another. Go ahead.
I just wanted to make another point that I think that in our culture today is lost, and that is that, as you said, Paul also said that Satan, there is a real devil, and he masquerades as an angel of light, and also has his ministers. He has false ministers. And so we need to begin to wrap our minds around the fact that there are false churches that are not teaching true doctrines, as opposed to Christ said He would build His church. And so we need to make evaluations about, is this church really God's church, or is it frankly a tool of Satan with false doctrines and false ministers, as blunt as that may be?
What about another attribute that church is supposed to reflect? And actually, it ties into a question that we had. The question is, would they be someone who is looking for to connect to a church? Would they be looking for a community to connect to? Would they be looking to a community? And that touches on another aspect of what the church should be, and that is a brotherhood. Do you think that resonates with a lot of young people? Josh, what would you say?
I think that is important. It's not the only thing.
Sure.
The church needs the truth. It needs to teach the truth. But the community is important. Some of the scriptures in the New Testament talk about, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together. Basically, go to church together. And why do you do that? You go so you can stir up good works in each other, and you can stir up love with each other and for each other. You develop relationships. One thing I think about is when you read Paul's letters to the different churches, how many times does he write to a friend or a close acquaintance, and he says, please greet this person and greet this person, and they've clearly built bonds of friendship and really brotherhood as Christian brothers and sisters, and that's very important. I mean, Christianity comes down to relationships with people, how you treat people, and God wants us to develop those, like a church community and family atmosphere.
But can't you just stay at home and be going to church by watching a video or watching a program on TV? I mean, isn't that just as good? Just even It could be a favorite preacher that you have, and is that not just as good? Because if you love Jesus and you're, watching church, is that just as good?
I think that's part of the problem. One of the articles that we were looking at brought out is that in general, the attitude in America is that people are doing many things alone that they used to do more with friends and family. Mm-hmm. It's just a more independent culture, and then the technology we have today enables that. We have our phones, we have our iPads. We can do. There's a lot of, you could say, inward-focused technology, video games, and different things. And if you're not careful, you can just become so independent that you don't want to reach out and spend literal time face-to-face with people. And that can have an effect on church attendance, because like you're saying, it would be a lot more physically comfortable to sit on my couch and watch a sermon on YouTube on a TV or an iPad. But how many people are you talking to and learning about what's going on in their life? Or can I help them on the weekend? Or they're getting married in a few months, or maybe someone has a health trial, and I can pray about that if I talk to them in conversation. So you're missing huge pieces of what God wants by attending church if you stay home and just watch something on TV.
So let me ask you, Rod, is it a sin not to go to church?
Well, when we look at the Ten Commandments, we see that the fourth commandment is talking about resting on the Sabbath day, on the seventh day. But we also find scriptures in the Bible that it's not just a rest, it's not just a time to do nothing, it's a time to honor God and to worship God. And I think we have come to the point in our society today where, as Josh was saying, that a lot of people have gotten confused about what the purpose of church is and don't understand that it's not about just being a consumer. It's not about, because if we get to that point, then we can think, well, I can hear the message at home. I can just be connected via live stream. But it's about being a participant. It's about being a part of a body. And Christ said that the church is his body. And he's the head, and it has many members. And God puts us in places in the body. So very, very important that we not only are just sort of a casual observer or sort of just tune in. The internet, although it's a wonderful tool for those who are not able to have access to to contact with God's people every week, and they're sick or they're in a situation, a shut-in or something. But it really doesn't take the place of real contact with other people who are walking the way that Christ outlined.
Go ahead.
If I may add just one thing to what Mr. McNair is saying about the Sabbath, maybe for young people, I know I've had this thought that maybe the Sabbath can feel or sound very Old Testament-y, if you can say that, or just a long way off. That's something they did, before, in the BC time. It's not relevant for today. But if you look at the New Testament, as we've mentioned, Jesus Christ and the apostles did go to church on the weekly Sabbath. Week after week, some of the passages show that. And it's not just I'm trying to earn my salvation with works. If you really look at it, you can break the Ten Commandments, as we explain on our different programs, that you can break the Ten Commandments into the first four are really ways to honor and love God, which I think any Christian would say that's important. You have to love and honor God. And then the last six are talking about loving your neighbor. But the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath properly, is right there in some of the main ways to show God that you honor him, that you love him. You take a break from your weekly routine and you think more about him. You pray more than maybe a regular weekly day. And you use that holy time. The commandment shows that it's holy time. And you say, God, I want to be closer to you. I'm going to think about how you created the world and the universe, as the commandment talks about. So it's not just a legalistic type commandment. It is a way to show love to God. And I think that's important for people to make that connection.
So Sabbath, so church, going to church, going to ecclesia, a gathering of called out ones, believers who gather together. It's a part of the Sabbath day, and it's important.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just close with this. We're just about out of time here, but let me just close with a question for both of you. Let's say a 15-second question for you both, and that is this: why is church important today? Why is, I'll say, going to church important today? Roger, you're up first. We'll give our Skyper first dibs here.
In 15 seconds, okay. Because
time's up. No.
I hope that was helpful.
You can have my 15 seconds if you want.
Because it is important, because the role of the church, one of the things that we haven't even touched on here, and it's a big topic, but the role of the church is also to be doing a work and to be warning this present generation, where when we find ourselves in the last days, to be warning this generation of judgment coming on our world for sin. And the church is the organism and the mechanism that is involved in preaching that gospel. So that's a huge reason that we need to be a part of the church.
Josh?
I think I would think about some of the fundamental questions of life. God is real, and if you believe the Bible is His Word, as we do, you prove that, and then you want to be a part of whatever the Bible is talking about. And then Jesus Christ clearly showed that I will build my church on the rock, which He was talking about Himself. And then He said the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So whatever church He started when He was alive has always been and comes down to today. So if I was a person searching for the true church, I would say, what did Christ do when He was alive? Clearly there's a church that He built that still exists, and I want to find that church so ultimately I can be like Him and I can be closer to God.
Okay, thank you both. I appreciate it. We're out of time here on our TWNow. Thanks for being with us here today. Thank you both to our guests, Mr. Rob McNair, Mr. Josh Lyons, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for being with us.